himself is not in a position to judge what is right or wrong. He doesn't have a fixed standard which is actually not arbitrary. What you would find is, in fact, that that standard will change from time to time, from place to place, and from incident to incident. That's the reality of Western law. To give an example, we saw in the past there were very harsh sentences in the Western system, which were used to the extent that in Britain, for example, there were 220 different offences which were punished by capital punishment. Yeah, so 200, you've heard maybe the song 6 Million Ways to Die. Well, they didn't have 6 million ways to die, but it had 220 ways that you could die in a British court. In contrast to that, today, you have an environment where, on the basis of freedom, on the rights of the criminal, that he needs to be respected because of his human rights, now it's gone to the extreme in the other direction. There was actually a case a few weeks ago. The system is so lax in dealing with crime that there was a case of a prison in Holland where the prisoners were on release because obviously they go home on the weekend. Yeah, so they were all at the home, visiting family and so on, because they've got everyone. Even if you go to prison, you've got to see your family, and the best way to do it is go around their house. So these prisoners were at home, and they returned to a shocking scene because they came back to their prison cells where they're being punished for crimes, and their televisions had been stolen. Their televisions had been stolen. So obviously they made complaints, this is unacceptable, we shouldn't be victims of crime, we have rights too. So obviously they were very upset about the situation. This happened in February 2010. March 2010, a month later, obviously the prisoners looked into it. We have to make sure we deal with the rights of our prisoners. They need to be able to watch, American Gladiator, or whatever shows they want to watch on television. It's unacceptable. They take all of the steps they could to stop this crime from happening again, and in March 2010, the prison is burgled again. All of the televisions are stolen. So what this example illustrates, and it's a problem that you find widespread actually, is that the dealing with the issue of crime, harsh punishment, has gone from being too excessive in one era to now being very lax. Because the judgment about what's right and wrong is swayed by different events in the society, the fact that there will be a different view on one day to another. So in sum, what you find is you're dealing with a system that's completely arbitrary in the way that it judges what's right and wrong. Even when we look to the issue of the Islamic system, actually we found, okay, I thought you were going to stand when I had less than 1 minute left. Okay, never mind. What we found is that there were heavy criticism in the past. Orientalists used to criticize the Islamic world because they said it encouraged immorality. The reason why is because a woman in Islam was allowed to seek divorce. So it was seen as this is too lewd. This Islamic system is far too crude. The way that it deals with man and woman's relationship is absolutely immoral. Whereas today, the same Islamic rules, those rules haven't changed actually. They've been fixed and dealt with the relationship in the same way. Now today, we find Muslims believing in those values, wanting to live by those values, are criticized for a system that is actually too harsh in the way it deals between the man and the woman. The woman is a victim of oppression. So before, those rules were criticized for actually violating norms because they gave the woman the opportunity, the ability to seek divorce, and now we found the same, okay, that's what you meant by standard, right? Okay. Now we find the same Islamic rules are criticized because of being oppressive. And obviously mixed in that are a lot of issues of culture and so on. But the broad issue is here. You find with the Islamic system agreed standards for society. You find an environment that's built within society that actually builds strong, cohesive values. And finally, you find a system which, while it deals with crime at the maximum level, deals with it in a harsh way, but also gives a basic standard of innocent until proven guilty, and actually has dealt with crime in this basis for 1400 years. I'll finish there, and I thank you for your time and hope to start.
Just everyone put their phones on silent just to make sure there's no more interruptions. And Mr. Lincoln Allison.
All the best speeches start with complete irrelevance, and I'm going to start with something completely irrelevant. A couple of years ago, I was asked to review a book claiming that William Shakespeare did not write the works attributed to William Shakespeare. In this particular case, they were attributed to a man called Sir Henry Neville. It's usually either the Earl of Oxford or Francis Bacon. As book reviews go, it was quite successful. It got an awful lot of response, stimulated a lot of debate. Because the two sides of this argument, the one about Shakespeare, like the one about Sharia, tend to be fairly passionate and to have a pretty healthy contempt for one another. But in following this debate, I did notice that the book was 400 pages long, and I'd only ever quoted anything from pages 1 to 7. The reason for this was that the book starts on an absurd premise. The premise being that whoever wrote the plays of Shakespeare must have gone to university. Therefore, William Shakespeare couldn't have written them. A preposterous premise. Garbage in, garbage out. If you have a preposterous premise like that, there is no chance of you coming to an acceptable philosophical conclusion. Thus it is with Sharia, or any other form of theocratic law. Now, I'm not an expert on Sharia, and I don't really want to talk about the content of it. When I taught legal philosophy 30 years ago as part of political philosophy, I did have the effrontery to give a lecture on Sharia in its Iranian form. This was in order to give the impression that my political theory was absolutely up to date. 30 years ago takes you back to 1981. The Iranian Revolution, as you know, was in 1979. So I did then know the distinctions made in Sharia law, not particularly hostile to its content, as will emerge in the debate. Bit of barbarism in the right place can be very useful, etc. I also have another interest that I wrote for a travel article that I was writing recently. I counted up the number of countries I'd been to where most people believe in Islam, and I came to 26, which is a pretty high proportion of the total, I think you'll find, and had certain reflections on those. Not particularly interested in Sharia when I've been in Islamic countries. I've found things that were far more interesting. When I first got to a predominantly Islamic country at the age of 17, simply by hitchhiking on and on and on, till I got to Palermo and got on a boat and went to North Africa, the two things that interested me most were actually the singing of Kulthum, I don't know whether many people here are familiar with it, and Arabic calligraphy, which I spent many hours in cafes having Arabic calligraphy explained. But you don't have to be an expert on Sharia to know what's wrong with it, any more than you have to investigate the details of flat earth theories to know that the earth is round to anyone of a philosophical or scientific disposition. And note, it is the idea of Sharia here that I'm attacking, not necessarily the content. The predominant fallacy is about law. The definition of law is of a system of rules successfully enforced by states over defined territories. I take it that's one of the most acceptable, broadly known definitions in modern social science. Laws are made by people. They are not discovered or derived from nature, from reason, or from God's will. This remains true even if those making the laws either believe that they are discovering them by the discovery of God's will, or falsely claim that they are discovering them through reason, nature, or God's will. Note that the fallacy that there is something, law comes from somewhere other than lawmakers who enforce it, has been the norm in human society, just as the belief in the flat earth has been pretty common as well. It isn't particularly Islamic. For most of the history of Christianity, law was clerical law, based on the Bible. This did not stop, as many people think, with the Reformation, but was continued for more than 100 years by the Anglican Church, and theocracy in this country reached its extreme form under Cromwellian rule in the 1650s. Only with the breakdown of clerical authority in the 18th century do we get a philosophically acceptable account of law. And that is found particularly in a number of philosophers, particularly in Jeremy Bentham's attack on William Blackstone's commentaries on English law. Blackstone attempted to derive the content of English law formed by custom, by practice, by special interest, all the ways in which law is normally formed, not from the decisions of courts and parliament, which it really came from, but from something called natural law. Please note what happened to when this breakdown of clerical authority occurred in the 18th century. It gave us an unprecedented flowering of philosophy, science, arts, technology, and led, for example, to English becoming the world's language. One of the first people to recognise what was happening in England in the 18th century was the French refugee Voltaire, who made a memorable remark in London in 1733, where he said the English have for the first time in history abolished heresy. There is no heretic in England except the bankrupt. This, in the French version, it is Musulman. In the English version, which was actually published first for political reasons, it is Mahometan. The Mahometan, the Jew, and the Christian meet in London, and there is no heretic except the bankrupt, he said. That's a famous description of a free and commercial society, there for the first time in England in the 18th century. Compare, if you will, what went on in the Islamic world at the time. Here you have a society rising, full of energy, might be a bit dangerous, jewellers might have to lock their doors a couple of times, but it's far more exciting, far more productive, has far more of a future. A rational person would never accept the word of another person about God's will. Note that, as with Christianity, there are violent disagreements, even about the primary sources of Shari'a. A rational person would never accept theocracy, because the rule of God always reduces to the rule of those who claim to know God's word. Theocracy reduces always to clerisy. It's the rule of priests. Now, rule is bad. I follow Harold Laswell, the psychopathology of politics. To want to rule other people is to be a psychotic of a certain kind. Maybe a necessary psychotic. Maybe somebody who has to exist, but somebody of whom we must always be suspicious. Any genuine liberal must believe that. And the worst of all psychotics, are those who claim they know God's will. They've always been the most dangerous.